My name is Dr. Seth Grooms. I'm a citizen of the Lumbee Nation of North Carolina. I'm an archaeologist. I'm a professor at Appalachian State University of North Carolina. And I got into archaeology for a lot of reasons. Primarily among them was hoping to go back home after I got the qualifications I needed to be a professional archaeologist and a professional researcher, to go back home and help my own tribe with our various cultural resource management and heritage initiatives. One of the common misconceptions that I run into, both as an educator and a professional archaeologist working in communities of different types, is that Native American tribes share opinions on broad topics like archaeology, like strategies for cultural resource management, and all sorts of other questions and topics. And that's not true just because of the bewildering, cultural, intellectual, political diversity among American Indian nations in this country. So there are over 600 tribes in the United States. And so when you talk about, what are Native Americans' opinions on archaeology and various research initiatives, things like that, and the utility and usefulness of archaeology, you're really not going to be able to get one answer, right? Just like you wouldn't be able to get one single answer from any, set of different communities that you would ask these questions of. So I always tell people to, do your research, at least for your state, and figure out what tribes' ancestral land is there. Are they still there? Are they in Oklahoma? Things like that. And then, do a little bit of research about their culture and history, because it's very different from tribe to tribe. And so that's one misconception that I run into a lot. Once you understand and you come into the situation aware of this diversity, both culturally and politically, of different Indian nations, understand that tribes and nations, right? Most of them in the U.S. have a constitutional-based government. Not all, but most, right? So it's a system of government that you would be familiar with as an American citizen, and that those representatives, elected representatives of those tribes, may have, and almost always do, have very different opinions on certain research initiatives and things done in their homelands compared to another tribe, right? So I think if you want to be an ally to American Indian tribes and an ethical, avocational archaeologist or citizen, it would behoove of you to go into that situation, understanding that diversity, right, and then do your research and figure out where you live, right, which tribes, what sorts of ancestral land are you on, and then do your research into those particular nations and tribes, and try to understand their structure of government, their elected officials, and who to contact, if that's appropriate, to contact their offices. NAGPRA, or the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, it was passed or enacted by American Congress in 1990. And what its purpose was to really protect the dignity of Native American people today and their ancestors as far as burials, human burials, and associated grave goods and objects of cultural patrimony, to use the language of the law. And so its purpose was, again, to protect the dignity of human burials regardless of your ethnicity group, and then also give, just as importantly, give Native American tribes a legal mechanism to request the return or the repatriation of certainly of ancestors, the physical remains of ancestors, but also important artifacts of various kinds. And so to give tribal nations that legal mechanism to ask different institutions, whether that was universities, museums, or federal agencies that had collected Native American human remains and associated artifacts over the decades. The closest thing to a national digital database in this country is probably TDAR, which stands for the Digital Archaeological Record. But even that, TDAR is probably geared more towards professional researchers because of the sensitive nature of archaeological site location information, which is protected by law, right? So not any old person can access the actual locational information of sites. And so for those reasons and laws, similar laws, those sorts of databases have limited access. So I would say people in Missouri, right, avocational archaeologist, or if you're a farmer and you find artifacts on your land, that sort of thing, you're probably wanting to make sure you're in contact with the State Historic Preservation Office, or SHPO, in Missouri. And they have site reporting databases and things like that, where if you find a site on your land, on private land, and you want to let the authorities know about that kind of stuff, the SHPO would be the people to contact first. And they can assign your site an official site number, and that information can be incorporated into Missouri's archaeological site file. In addition to contacting the SHPO for the state of Missouri, you would also maybe want to contact the Missouri Archaeological Society. They offer a lot of training for avocational archaeologists to make sure that you actually have the skills to be an ethical and responsible avocational archaeologist. And they also are a great point of contact for any questions you would have. Your local archaeological society, and again in Missouri, that's the Missouri Archaeological Society, a great point of contact. If you don't know who to contact, the folks who organize those societies, they almost certainly will, and they would be able to put you into contact with people at the State Historic Preservation Office, or if it's appropriate, to contact relevant tribes, right? So I would suggest before you fire off a cold email to a tribe through their Tribal Historic Preservation Office, or TIPO, that you maybe first check with folks at the Missouri Archaeological Society or the State Historic Preservation Office, just to limit the number of emails that TIPOs and tribes are trying to deal with. It's important to understand that Native people have inhabited the area of modern day Missouri for thousands of years, 10, 12,000 years, possibly longer. And so the range of artifact types will depend on what kind of site you've discovered and the history of Native occupation there. But it can range. Some of the oldest artifact types belong to what archaeologists call the Paleo-Indian period. And so this is an archaeological period that we define by certain types of artifacts, like large stone hunting projectile points or spear points, a time before pottery was being made, and a time before people were farming. So they were hunting and gathering, they're foraging, they're hunting big game if it's long enough ago in the ancient past. And then you move up through time, and the types of artifacts that you may find change according to the age of the site and what it was used for. So in general, arrowheads, you have other types of projectile points like atlatl darts. The atlatl was a hunting system that predates the bow, and it consists of sort of a lever system and a dart, and it essentially increases the velocity that a hunter could throw a spear point with compared to just your shoulder, right? So atlatl darts tend to be a little bigger than arrowheads. And then arrowheads, which the bow was introduced in various parts of the country, say around 1,000 years ago to as recently as 700 years ago. So that's the bow and arrow is not a technology that is as ancient as most people think it is. So before that time, we're looking at atlatl darts, also pottery, depending on the age of the site. So usually pottery is a great, or at least a very abundant type of artifact, because ceramic survives just sort of the ravages of nature and time pretty well. And you'll often find evidence of pottery as what we call sherds, so small pieces of pottery that's broken up. Stone beads shale artifacts sometimes depending on the soil chemistry. So very acidic soils, calcium dissolves fairly quickly, so you won't get shale or animal bone artifacts depending on the acidity of the soil. But those are an example of some types of artifacts that you could find in Missouri. Repatriation means, I think a definition you could find on like Merriam, a dictionary would be returning someone to their home, their homeland, their home country. That's the spirit of that word, repatriation, and what it means in archaeological context in North America. So Native American repatriation is returning the physical remains of Native American ancestors to their ancestral land. And again, the most relevant and most powerful legislation or law that deals with repatriation in this country is NAGPRA, again, that we talked about earlier, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Various types of artifacts can have varying levels of significance to different tribes, right? Speaking back to what we discussed earlier, right? With all tribes are different and will have different opinions on cultural resource strategies, cultural resource management strategies, and archaeology more broadly. Speaking for my tribe and not speaking for others, artifacts, all artifacts that were made by our ancestors down in south central and southeastern North Carolina are important in the sense that they're part of our cultural heritage and they're the material remains of that. And then, our TIPO, our Tribal Historic Preservation Office, who I work with back home, the reason that we do archaeology when we decide that it's worth it to disturb a site is to document and preserve that cultural heritage. And that way, what we find by doing archaeology in our homeland, in addition to oral histories and what our family stories and our elders say about our history, it can all help to inform various cultural heritage preservation strategies, right? Especially for teaching our youths about our history and our culture. And I think that generally is probably true of a lot of tribes. But again, speaking for the Lumbee tribe. And then there's a varying range of opinions on that stuff. Some tribes, their TIPOs are going to be more supportive or less supportive of disturbing sites at all in doing archaeology, at least in an invasive, disturbing way, disturbing the ground. And then again, within communities. So, when we're talking about a TIPO office or a tribal council, those are elected officials, right? They're, in theory, they represent the majority of the opinion of their community that they lead and they were elected to represent. But we know, just like in American society, that's not always the case. Just because Congress passes a law doesn't mean that 100% of its citizens agree. And that's true of tribal governments. So even if you have a particular TIPO that is, quote unquote pro-research, right? They're supportive of doing archaeology. That certainly doesn't mean that all citizens will be supportive of that. And that's true of my own community. Like I said, I work with our TIPO and we do some archaeology down in our homelands. But sometimes elders from the community, to be frank, they may believe that it's inherently wrong to disturb sites at all and that archaeology shouldn't be done. And you just have to find a way to hopefully reach respectful compromises on those issues. And again, for outsiders and people, non-native people, the thing to know and the thing to take away is that don't assume that tribes either agree with one another because they're separate entities and separate governments. And then even within tribes, if you get an elected body like a tribal council or a tribal historic preservation office, just because they have an opinion, again, does not necessarily mean that on the ground, when you're doing that research and engaging with community members, that you won't have various opinions on the ethics and the morality and the necessity of archaeology. Another common question that archaeologists get, and one that I myself deal with quite often, is what are the laws about what you can and cannot do on private property versus public property? Can you dig on private property? Can you collect things from the surface on different types of land? And so the answer to that is always going to vary from state to state, right? There are federal laws that govern the legality of different types of avocational archaeology. But there are additional state laws that will vary, again, state by state. And then going back to our previous discussion of these topics about points of contact in the state, your SHPO, your State Historic Preservation Office, as well as the Archaeological Society, here the Missouri Archaeological Society, are both great points of contact to educate yourself on the both state and federal laws regarding cultural resources and archaeology. But just as a general rule of thumb, as a professional archaeologist, I always advise that people not dig anywhere, even if you're on your own private property and you might have the legal right to do that. The reason that I advise not to ever dig is because it takes a lot of training to be able to appreciate and document important contextual details and information about artifacts. And when they're found in place, and that information is easy to overlook, and once it's disturbed, it's gone forever. And so we lose that part of our shared cultural heritage and shared history that we all hopefully want to protect and respect. So I would say that avoid digging, whether it's on private or public property. Now, digging on public lands is illegal. So like state parks and things like that, that's illegal. Surface collecting, right? So when you're not disturbing ground, you're not digging into the ground, but you may find artifacts strewn on the surface. This can happen for a lot of reasons. They may erode out of the ground from rainfall and things like that. It could be a road cut and you see things coming out of it, or which is probably the most common scenario, is that you're a farmer or you know a farmer and the land is tilled, things like that, plowed, and artifacts come up that way. That's legal to collect things from the surface, but what we advise people to do is, again, be in contact with your local archaeological society and your SHPO, and make sure that you take advantage of oftentimes free volunteer opportunities to get training, to be able to record information about things you find on the surface. And again, if you know what you're looking for, and say you, every time you plow your land on your private property, you see a lot of artifacts come up, that's time to contact the SHPO. They're not going to come in and take things from you. You don't have to worry about that sort of stuff. But what it'll do, again, is alert the SHPO that there could be a site on your land, and then in some cases they'll even give you issue a site number and incorporate that information into state databases. So always, again, seek out that formal training, whether it's through the Missouri Archaeological Society or other smaller regional chapters of archaeological societies. Universities sometimes do this for avocational archaeologists, right? And be in contact, be a good steward of our cultural heritage and the state of Missouri's cultural heritage, and do that by, remember, respecting the sovereignty of tribal nations and understanding the composition of different tribes and their ancestral links to the land that you reside on, being in contact with your local archaeological society, taking advantage of training opportunities, and being in contact with your SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office, and sharing information with them when it's relevant as far as artifacts that you are finding, again, on the surface. And then again, to drive that point back home, I would advise people to not dig, regardless of if it's on your land or not. And then one more thing to add is that when we start talking about disturbing human remains or human burials, right, unmarked burials, even if it's on private property, that's always a no-go. And then if you disturb unmarked graves, right, on regardless of the type of land you're on, then you're getting into a felony offense. So I would advise, that's another reason to just stay away from digging if you're not a professional archaeologist. Another common question I get is how to handle archaeological artifacts and also sites with respect in reference to Native American tribal nations. And one thing, I'll use an example of Cahokia, since it's such an important site in this area. It's important to remember, going back again, circling back and touching on the diversity of Indian nations in this country. When you talk about a place like Cahokia, a common misconception is that there's a neat one-to-one ratio as far as the relationships of one tribe to one site. And that's just not the case. So like for a place like Cahokia, it's a World Heritage Site, and there are many Native American tribes that have ancestral affiliation with places like Cahokia. And they all have different opinions about how those places should be managed, the behavior of visitors to those sites, so on and so forth. So as a good blanket rule, when you visit places like Cahokia, follow the rules that you see stated on signs, right? When it comes to Native American earthen mounds, right, like that Cahokia is famous for, certainly do not play on the sides of mounds, run on non-marked trails, and disturbing the mounds like that. Use that site and that important park that's open to the public. Use it according to the rules that are stated on the signage and park rangers and things like that, because often those things were developed in conversation with the tribes whose ancestors built those places. And so don't be afraid or shy about enjoying places like Cahokia, but just be respectful and mindful that there are people alive today whose ancestors made those places, and they're important for ongoing cultural identity. And so just be mindful of that. And another kind of related question I get is when to contact tribes. So say you've found a site on your private property, and you're in Missouri and you've done your research and you think you should contact the Osage Nation or the Quapaw Nation. That's a good instinct, but you have to be mindful also that oftentimes THPOs, right, Tribal Historic Preservation Offices and officers, they're often, they have their hands very full working on their own communities' cultural resource preservation and education initiatives. And they often don't have the bandwidth to respond to lots of cold call emails about artifacts on different sites. So what I'm not saying is not to contact tribes, but just be mindful. Whether you get a response or not, those folks are busy, and they often are again prioritizing the wants and needs and interests of their own nation and their own citizens. So again, I think that's why it's important to, yes, understand what tribes are affiliated with the area that you live in, but also be in constant contact with places like the SHPO, who are going to be able to, oftentimes they may know individuals in different tribal historic preservation offices, and may be able to tell you and give you advice on the appropriate way when and if you should try to contact THPOs and things of that nature. A parting kind of message and a bit of advice that I would give to people who want to be good allies and partners with cultural resource professionals and Native American tribes is that understand that, you know, many of us agree that archaeology has a lot to contribute to our overall society and our sense of cultural heritage and history. But once you go down that path of doing your own research and educating yourself on, again, the political and the cultural diversity of tribal nations in this country, try to understand that some will agree that archaeology should be done on ancestral lands, and some will disagree. And that you need to go into those conversations, if you ever have them, with a THPO or a citizen of a tribal nation, understanding and respecting the potential for disagreement on that. And I think that would be a bit of advice I would give for people who really do have the goodwill and good intentions and want to be good stewards of the cultural heritage of this country. To conclude, I just want to thank you for taking the time to watch this video, and it's the first step in us all coming to the table representing different stakeholders, different communities, and different heritages to come together and find common ground and find ways to respectfully and in a collaborative way move forward and all enjoy and share and preserve and document cultural heritage.